US publisher Genius Games has been releasing science-based design since 2014, typically taking a scientific concept from biology or chemistry, extracting the heart of that concept, and then transforming it into a game where you are playing through what is actually happening in the real world. Its newest release in early 2022 is Cellulose, a plant cell biology game in which you are living inside plant cells and operating them and seeing all the elements that are going on in there. I have not played this yet. This is a review copy from Genius Games, but just wanted to highlight the type of game they release. Instead, I'm going to focus on Genotype, a Mendelian genetics game that came out in early 2021. And like many Genius Games titles, it has solitaire rules. In addition to the rule book, it has a book explaining the science behind genotype so that you can explore the concept in more detail should you wish to. It is not the typical educational game where you have some sort of simple game that just has some sciencey label slapped on it. No, you are trying to understand the concept more fully because it's been embedded in the game design. Let me start by giving you an overview of what you're trying to do. Here are the components of Genotype set up for a 3-player game. It's a lot to take in initially, but we can ignore most of it to begin with and instead focus on the individual player board, because most of the points that you'll gain over the course of the game come from plants that you will place on your board and then investigate, ideally validating all of the traits on the individual pea plants. In the game, we are the assistants of Gregor Mendel, who was a 19th century monk who cultivated and hybridized thousands of pea plants, looking at those plants and the traits that carried down from one generation to the next to develop the concept of genes that we have today, that being an individual element, a trait within a living being that has a chance of passing that trait on to its next generation and subsequent generations after that. Throughout the game, you are trying to validate traits on the pea plant cards, with each card having 2 to 4 traits, and these traits corresponding to the color of the flowers on the plant or the color of the pea pods, whether the plant is tall or short, and, not shown here, whether the peas are round or wrinkled. You validate a trait typically by drafting a die from the board. In this case, you have 2 recessive traits that correspond to a white flower. If you draft this die, you're going to put it on your card. You then cover that trait. And once you cover all the traits on a card, there are different ways to do so, you can harvest that plant and replace it with something else that you are investigating. And at the end of the game, you will score the full point value for a card if you have validated all of its traits. If you have validated only some of its traits, you score 1 point for each trait that you have completed, but otherwise get nothing else for that work. At the start of the game, you receive a hand of 3 pea plant cards. You will choose 1 to start and play and a second to be in your hand, with the remaining 3rd card being discarded. The cards will be worth different points depending on the number of traits on the card and the difficulty of validating those traits. You probably want to choose cards that have overlapping traits if possible so that you can score endgame bonuses for researching those specific traits. Each of the 5 game rounds consist of 3 phases, with the first phase being a worker placement phase where players take turns placing their trowels on the game board or on your personal player board to take the action associated with that space. The second phase is a dice drafting phase. You use the dice to validate your traits. And the third phase is a buying phase where you can spend money to improve your chances of, in the long run, validating those traits. In general, the actions let you do one of 4 things. You can gain more pea plants, so you'll have more to work on. You can take actions that will allow you to more easily validate the traits. You can do research so that you'll earn points at the end of the game for the plants that you have fully validated, and you can take actions to gain money. You can, for example, go to the treasury, take 2 coins, and add it to what you have. That's straightforward. You can go to a first shift spot for one of the traits. If you're the first player to take one of these 2 actions for the traits, you gain a coin, and you will be the first player to draft a red die during that phase of the round. You don't know what's there. but you're first for whatever is coming. If you want to change the odds of what will come up on the dice, you can instead go to the parent spot and you can take one of the banners from the side of the board and put it on this section here, and that alters the outcome of what the dice will be. You can remove a banner that's already there. You can add a second banner to completely change what's there. So over 2 rounds, one person can add this banner, someone else adds this banner, and now whatever the die results, it's all going to be a pair of recessive traits, because those are the only traits of this type, the flower color type, that will be available. You can go to the second shift spot so that after all the first picks are done, you get first choice of whatever is left, and other people can go here as well and choose an order. You can set a research goal by spending 2 or 3 coins. You will place a marker on one of the available spaces here, and at the end of the game, I score 3 points for each of my fully validated cards that has this particular trait in it. I already have one here, and as I showed you my cards at the beginning, you know I have a second one in my hand. You can place a trial here to get a tool. They're all one-time use tools. You get it for free in games of 4 or 5 players. There's a second spot, but otherwise, first come, first serve in a game with fewer than 4 players. You can go to the nursery and pick up 2 plants from what's available here or the top of the deck. You can go to the university and pay a coin or 2, and you immediately validate a trait of your choice. It costs money, but you're not relying on the dice. You can get a temporary dice slot where you are going to now have room for 4 dice instead of just 3. You can, of course, spend spaces for lots of dice slots, but whatever you're doing, you're not doing something else. You can garden, where you pick up a card, and that would probably be my first choice here. Pick up a card from either the display of plants or tools or the top of the deck. You harvest anything that has been fully validated, which is nothing in this case, and then plant something from your hand. Well, this has both a double recessive F and double recessive G, which will match if I end up being able to do this. If possible, I might want my second action to be take money, which I already have from my example previously. My third action, again, if available, go here, spend those 2 coins, and lock in either the FF or the GG, because I have both of them here. Let's go with GG for good game. Yes. Those might be my 3 choices. Other players are going to take actions as well. We then roll all 20 dice. Whatever the player counts, you're going to roll these 20 dice. If you have mutation symbols, you can put those aside for now. And the dice otherwise are going to go on the board based on this chart here. So if you've got a 1, you can look and see it's a dominant trait. This is what happens. This little Punnett square here is showing you what would happen if you crossbreed plants with these particular traits. Most of the time, 50% of the time, dice will end up in this slot here, but you're rolling only 5 dice. So the odds will often not work out based on what you think will happen. So this is what we have initially, but you re-roll all the mutation dice. If anything still comes up in mutation, you leave it there. Okay, here's what we have. If people have chosen first shift, they are going to choose one of the available dice. You might notice that there are no GG, no small GG, no recessive GG, which means I cannot choose any of the dice here to cover this space. If you get a mutation, if, for example, one of these dice were like so, during the dice drafting phase of the game, I could take a mutation and any other die of that same color, put it over on my board here, and now I can cover a GG. But I've used 2 of my available 3 dice spots to mark one thing. I could also, if these are still available, if other people have not chosen them, and you cannot take a die that you cannot use, I could take this one and mark off this card, and now I've covered these 2 traits, Next time I garden, or at the end of the game, I will score 7 points for this plant. As I mentioned, you cannot take a die that you cannot use. So people just can't take these away so that I don't get an FF, assuming I had more spaces available. Maybe I don't even want to do this, assuming this is available. Maybe I want to first take this, the double T, assuming again, it's my choice to go first. I can mark this off and now nothing's available. There's 3 of these. I don't have to rush. Maybe no one else is looking for G's at this moment, or I'm just not going to bother because maybe I can end up getting 2 of these and I'll cover 3 traits instead of 1. Maybe that's what I'm going to do instead, depending on what comes up here. You can definitely get less than ideal odds. So for example, this was the initial result. So if anyone needed either of these, they're out of luck. You now have a buying phase that takes place in reverse player order, where you can buy new plots. This gives you an additional space in which to put plants when you are gardening. You can buy dice slots, and that gives you another spot to place a die over the course of the game. You can buy another action marker so that you can now take another action during each of the first phases for the remainder of the game. You can buy an assistant. There's a small deck of assistants. There are 3 available each round. They all have different powers that happen over the course of the rest of the game for however long you have them. For example, this guy, effectively, you were always first in the second shift. You don't even have to put a marker there. You are just going to get something after all of the first shifts have gone. This guy here, he gives you another space to put a plant. If you end up buying him, or rather hiring him for the 2 coins that it cost, you immediately take a plant from what's on display or from the deck, and he carries it around with him. And if you finish putting all those traits on there, you're going to score that, and then you can plant something on him later using the gardening action. It sounds so impersonal, but so be it. The sister, you can pay a coin once per round and cover a trait of your choice. And if you have super hard traits to get, maybe this would be the ideal person to hire. Each time you spend money to get one of these things, the price goes up. So if I'm buying an assistant, it costs 2. The price then goes to 3 for everyone who comes after me. If someone else buys, it goes 4, and it doesn't go higher than that. At the end of the round, we clear off all the dice. You clear away all the cards that have been put out. All the prices fall by 1. So if no one wanted to buy before, they were not enticed for a new dice slot or a new plot, well, now it's only 1 coin. You're not going to get cheaper than that. Maybe now you want to buy? You go to the next round, you pass the trowel to the next start player, and you keep going. The different tool effects are often just something helpful once. This flower pot, for example, works just like this brother, but it's only a one-time use. This is a flower pot, and this is a human. The human is better than the flower pot because he's reusable. It's kind of a weird concept, but sure. The seed bag, you draw 5 cards from the deck of plants and keep 2 of them. So you have more choices available to ideally get the traits that you're looking for, either traits that come up very commonly, so you're more likely to be able to complete those cards, or traits that match whatever you've researched, because you want to specialize in that. Here you have a rake. It's one-time tool. You can spend the rake and take a die and use it for whatever trait you want. So if I had a rake in my hand, I could have taken this die and just treated it as a double recessive G to mark a trait on my card. The hand lens, whenever you take one of the parent actions, one time when you take a parent action, you can discard the hand lens and get 2 coins. So it's kind of an alternate treasury that's connected to a specific action. You don't go to the treasury to get 2 coins. You go here to get this tool because you want to do this anyway, and then you're going to get money from it. A little roundabout here because in theory, you could just go here and get 2 coins and go here and do the action anyway. But so be it. You're working around the restriction that there's only 1 treasury slot available. in a game with fewer than 4 players. You finish the round, you clear everything away, you discard, set aside, retire, send on break the assistants, turn up new assistants, and begin the round. You're going to play through 5 rounds this way. All the plants that you have completed and put aside during gardening, because again, you were going to harvest completed, fully validated plants. All of those that you've put aside, you will score whatever the value is. You will score bonuses based on what you've marked here. Each remaining trait on a card is 1 point, each remaining coin is a point, and whoever has the most points wins. I played Genotype 4 times on a review copy from Genius Games, once each with 2 and 4 players, and twice with 3 players. In the solo game, you are competing against Brother Johann, an AI opponent that is controlled by a separate deck of cards that is used only for solo play. Gameplay in Genotype is smooth, and all the questions we've had come up during play have been answered in the thoroughly detailed rulebook. A rulebook that is almost a little over detailed because it feels like sections could have been streamlined in terms of how they were describing things, but all the questions have been answered, so I should possibly not complain about a rulebook that is too thorough. The gameplay flows smoothly, possibly because it contains familiar elements from other games where you have worker placement and a drafting period and buying stuff, which of course we encounter lots in real life too. You're putting those things together that all feel familiar, and the purpose of them is to drive you to an understanding of this concept of how you get descendants from particular parents and how you can change the parents, which will adjust the odds of the descendants you get. That is the heart of Mendelian genetics, and that is the core concept that you were trying to keep in mind while you were playing the game. Everything else is in service of that, and like many other games, you're trying to mark off things on a card. You're trying to complete a contract so that you can score the points for that. That all feels like a familiar concept, but again, it's in service of this idea of the input that you put in with the parents and what you're getting out of it. But of course, you were playing the odds as to what is going to come out, and often you don't get the results you think you will. As I mentioned, you have only 5 dice of each color, so you're not going to get a perfectly even distribution of what's coming out. You're not working like Mendel did with thousands of different pea plants. You're working with 5 dice at a time, so you're not going to get a smooth bell curve of probabilities coming out here. You may take a first pick, and then the thing you want is not available, or it's available with a mutation, but now you've devoted 2 of your slots to that, or there's no mutation and you just can't take anything, which has happened multiple times over the 4 games that we've played. And it feels like the coin that you pick up when you go to first pick is in some ways compensation in retrospect, because you get to the dice drafting phase and you get nothing available, and it's like, well, at least you got a coin, right? You got something out of it. It's not a treasury. It's only a half treasury action, but it's better than nothing. Or you'll go to adjust the Punnett square so that you can change the odds of what comes up. Maybe you're going to put up one of the banners, and now 50% of the time you'll get a dominant recessive pair, and 50% of the time you get a double recessive pair. You're still not guaranteed that you're going to get anything. And of course, if someone else adjusted the parent and you need a double dominant, there is now 0 chance of that happening other than having a mutation die come out. And again, you're forced to use 2 of your available dice slots to make that happen. So you're definitely playing the odds in terms of what's coming up, and those are often not favorable. And that's where you get into all the other elements of the game that are allowing you to change the odds of what comes up. But often it feels like there's limited abilities to do that, to adjust what's there. Because when you're actually sitting at the dice and staring at them, the only thing you can do is go for a rake, or the human counterpart to the rake, Sister Maria, who gives you a rake action each round. So Sister Maria rake and the rake will both let you take a die and use it for whatever you want. But otherwise, during the dice drafting phase, you just don't have that option. So maybe you don't want to focus specifically on one particular type of thing. You don't want all recessive or all dominant traits across the board because they are less likely to come up. maybe you want a dominant recessive and a recessive recessive and dominant dominant, depending on how many plots you have available in which to plant. And ideally, then you can draft whatever based on whatever the dice give you and whatever else people are taking. It's a nice touch that people can't take dice they don't need. So if there's one thing and I'm the only one who's looking for a double recessive T, no one else can take that unless they take a mutation and that die to turn it into something else. Possibly they can do that. Someone can also just take a mutation die and get a coin out of it. I'm not asking the details on how that works. I suppose there's an in-game explanation for how that happens, but someone can take a mutation die that you wanted to use and just get a coin out of it. And now you're stuck with no options available. It can definitely happen. And so again, you turn to other tools to try to make things happen. The incident of the rake that I mentioned, it's interesting because there's a lot of sponginess in the design, a sort of looseness to it, where you can often do the same thing multiple ways. So you can pick up the rake for a one-shot use, or you can hire Sister Maria Rake, as we often call her. So you can spend an action to get this one-shot tool, or you spend money to get Sister Maria. And of course, you took an action to get the money. So it's a little two-step process to make that happen. And now you have a rake that you can use permanently. And so you have other incidences like that, as I mentioned, with the one-shot flower pot or the living flower pot. Or you can spend money instead of this assistant, you can spend money for an extra plot. Although these come with a plant and this does not. So it's some sponginess there. Or you can buy a dice slot, or you can hire this guy who, for the cost of a coin, when you want to use him, gives you two places to put dice. So again, it's kind of the same thing, different. Or a pollen brush, where you cover a trait. So if I covered TT, dominant TT, dominant, double dominant T, I can spend a pollen brush and I cover all incidences of dominant T at once. So ideally, if I am specializing in cards, as I showed in my example with the double recessive Gs, and I get one double recessive G, I can spin a pollen brush and cover all of them. Or I get this lady, Sister May, who's a living pollen brush. Every time you validate a trait, you can validate all other traits of that type. So again, it's like the same thing coming up. Or the watering funnel, which is a one-shot tool where you get to validate any traits of your choice immediately, which is the same thing as the university action, except that cost you a coin or two. So it's like there's lots of ways to get to the same point. And the scores have often reflected that approach. You can also look at the available cards where they have two traits on them and they're worth a small number of points, like 6 to 8. Or they have 4 traits on them with, some recessive dominant mix or dominant mix or recessive, and those are 12 to 13 points. So they're more valuable, but of course it's much harder to complete them because they have more specific traits or just more traits. And it often feels like, if I remember correctly, photosynthesis, where you had points that you could get from the center. There was also like a range of 6 to 14. I'm trying to roughly remember this. And it seemed like you're trying to do lots of little value, or you're just doing a few big values. In the end, you sort of end up in the same place score-wise, because often you'll end up with an assortment of small ones, which take fewer actions to complete, just because of how things work out. And you use those extra actions to go to the research where you're going to score bonus points for what's on there. And so again, roughly all these things end up the same value in the end, the same total score. We've seen that play out most recently in the 4-player game, where people ended up 71, 70, 64, and I think high 50s. Don't remember on that one. But the 64, that was me. If I had gotten one more trait, and there were lots of dice left over that couldn't be used at that time, one more trait, would have completed that card, which would have given me, I think, 7 points instead of 2. And I had the research bonus for it, so that would have been 9 more points total. No, 7 more points total. 9 more points total, which would have put my score at 73. So there's lots of jumps that happen. It's not an incremental game where you're necessarily, at least based on the 4 games I've played, you're not going to end up with a huge pile of coins that is just going to transfer to points. You just typically have 1 or 2 coins left over, and that's that. And you have 1 or 2 traits on cards that weren't completed, and that's that. And you have enough research, typically, that it counts as another card or 2. So in that 4-player game, I did 1 research trait where I got 8 points, 8 bonus points out of it for cards that I had completed, and another one where I had 6. And 8 and 6 points is effectively just 2 more P-plant cards. So you're kind of taking different steps for how you're doing things, but ending up in the same place. And it comes down to the feeling that I was 1 die roll away from getting 9 more points and ending in first. What could I have done differently? Am I really just relying on the luck of the die? And especially in the final round, it feels like things just didn't come up right. And you won because of a lucky die roll instead of me. And maybe I'm overstating the importance of it, because there are some tools you can use to mitigate it. And you can go to university to spend coins to get the thing that you really need rather than relying on luck. But all of those actions come before the die roll. So you have to use the university, or use the rake, or not use the rake, use the watering funnel. You have to do that before the dice come up. So you're trying to complete something that you don't realize you're going to be short of, and you're still hoping to play the odds of what's going to come up there. And it can be a bit frustrating, but maybe that's just the nature of the game as well, where it's trying to show you you're not always going to get the thing you want, because the genetic odds just might not favor you in how everything works out. You can do the work as much as you can, do everything that you think is the right thing to do, and the genes aren't playing in your favor. That's just going to happen sometime, and that's a life lesson for a lot of people. Just how things come out, and your health effects, and genetic history, and family tree, and all that sort of stuff. It's not always going to work in your favor in terms of how things come out. And you just, to some degree, are like, okay, well, I'll take whatever steps I can, and hopefully the genetic lottery works out for me. That's the feeling of Genotype too, where on a much lower, consequence scale, you're playing the odds and seeing how things come out. And ideally, you're doing enough to mitigate all those circumstances to lock things in. So there you go, a review of Genotype, which goes up to 5 players. I've not played with 5, and it feels like that'd be very hard. One other element that came up over play is, as I mentioned, you're using all 20 dice, no matter how many players you have. So with 2 players, the openness of drafting, it's very rare that you are going to not be able to take enough dice to fill all your available slots, because there's only one other person who's drafting. So you have more of an incentive to not worry about the first pick so much, except if you want the coins, and maybe just buy dice slots or use an action to take a dice slot. But typically you just want to buy dice slots because there's the potential for you getting more dice, which means you're going to be possibly completing more cards, which means you might have to take gardening more often. Gardening is the only way to put more plants in the ground, unless you have a flower pot or a father flower pot, whatever his name is. It's the only way to get more plants in the ground, and then you have an action that's devoted to gardening, which feels a little bit like Martin Wallace's automobile, where one of your 3 actions in each round is devoted to making cars. It's the thing you have to do in order to progress. But it doesn't always have to be that way. I played one game where I gardened only 3 times. I think it was like the first, third, and 4th round or 5th round, because I had bought a plant, I got a flower pot. I did something where I was able to complete lots of cards, harvest them all at once, put out a new crop, and then work on all those. So there's some flexibility in what you're doing, but the the tightness of the dice pool definitely changes as you add more players in the game. I wanted to play with 4 after my first games because I just wanted to see the results. And yes, it was much tighter where you're paying a bit more attention to what other people have at the time you're drafting dice. Is this thing going to get back to me? Is anyone else possibly going to take it? What do I have to take first at the risk of someone else getting it? It's a lot tighter at 4 players than 3 or 2, and yet in the 4-player game, we still completed roughly the same number of plants. So things came out the same. So maybe we just did other things that allowed us to do roughly the same amount of work. Interesting to see. So there you go. Overview of Genotype. Maybe you want to experiment in your home.